one of the things that rolls off people's lips sometimes when they're talking about this, that when they come out, they say they become more authentic. And they go on to say what that means to them, which is completely legitimate. But it's a little off-putting for those of us who are proud and gay, but in a relationship with a straight person. I feel very authentically gay. Let's accept a broader picture. Maybe we're part of that LGBTQ plus part of it.
Welcome to Graying Rainbows, the podcast community for people coming out LGBT plus later in life. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell. You'll find additional episodes of Graying Rainbows on our website at grayingrainbows.com. You can send me email at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. Submit voice feedback at speakpipe.com/Doc Artemis, or post to the Graying Rainbows Facebook fan page. Today's interview is with retired Navy Captain Eric Kearsley. Eric is going to share his journey of not only coming out later in life, but actually staying married. I know you will find his story fascinating, and it's a great reminder that everyone's journey is unique. I will be back after the interview to tell you a little bit more about the Graying Rainbows community. Thanks so much for volunteering to come on the show today. My first question is, how did you find Graying Rainbows?
So I had done an interview with Kristen Colby of the Straight Spouse podcast. And when she did an interview for your podcast, she sent me the link. And I was delighted to hear that she's getting her message out and that there was a group called Graying Rainbows. I'm a graying rainbow. And I'm very interested in aging LGBTs and the support that they are receiving in the community. So it's a great group.
Well, thank you. And I really appreciate that Kristen is helping get the word out because it's still a really small show. And that's actually why I was asking you. And, one of the things is for podcasts, the best way to get new listeners is usually word of mouth. And a lot of the people that listen to this show are not in the position where they really feel like they're going to go around saying, hey, I just found this great podcast about coming out. So I think that's been a challenge for helping the show grow. So I appreciate that you're here today. So Eric, I usually ask my guests to just share their story. Are you ready to do that?
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the great things about your podcast. So our stories are the most powerful things that we can say and share because it's about us and how our story may resonate with other people. I was born, I won't go that far back. I knew I was attracted to boys as a teenager. This is back in the 60s. At the time, I thought everybody surely feels this way. And so I'm perfectly normal, but no one is allowed to talk about it. And there certainly wasn't any information. At 15, I entered a seminary. I was raised in a very Catholic household, and that seemed to be the best way to spend my life. And it was a convenient way for me to suppress any gay leanings or anything about my sexuality because, of course, you're headed for a vow of chastity. And it was a relief. I didn't have to worry about whether I was gay or straight. So I left the seminary at 19, of course, was a sophomore in college at this point. And then I realized I was going to live a, quote, life outside the seminary, outside the priesthood. So I dated. I also would occasionally go to a gay cinema or a gay bathhouse. But I dated and I had girlfriends. So everything seemed normal. And I thought, but I realized, now we're getting into the early 70s. I realized that this was not, it was a scary option to consider I might be gay. And I used every argument in the book to convince myself, well, you may have this attraction, but you're perfectly normal, and you could make the choice of what you wanted to be. And so I understand the people with more conservative views having that feeling. That was a prevalent feeling in those years. I joined the Navy. And of course, in order to get into the military, you had to certify that you were not a homosexual. Well, I knew I had those leanings, and so I joined the military and knew that I would have to be undercover, so to speak. So I had a full career in the Navy, 22 years, retired as a Navy captain. Those last 5 or 6 years were under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And this is from the perspective of a heavily closeted guy. I thought Don't Ask, Don't Tell was the greatest thing going. It gets a lot of bad reviews now because of the requirement to hide and not affirm who you are, which is a perspective from this time looking back. But for those of us in the early 90s, it felt to me like a protection. I retired, still closeted. I was completely monogamous with my wife. We got married in 1977 for about 13 years. I can pinpoint the date exactly because I knew where I was. I was on a Navy TDY in Vienna and came across a German bathhouse. And I went in. I didn't know whether it was a gay bathhouse or just a men's sauna. So I told myself, well, I'll go in and I'll just look. So that was my falling off the wagon, so to speak, racked with guilt because with the temptation in front of me, I couldn't resist. So I know that almost the exact date because when I eventually did come out to my wife, I told her that I'd been monogamous until that point. And so we had records, our old Christmas letters, we would describe what we each did, and the trip to Vienna for this TDY was right there, so it dated. Anyway, I realized that I had a problem. I never felt bad about my same-sex attraction. Well, I guess I must have in those early years. But what I really felt bad about was that I had not been able to be honest with my wife. I'd gotten married in 77, and I had just said I would give up those nasty trips to the bathhouses or the cinemas, and I would lead a, quote, normal life. But I couldn't reconcile that the person I was closest to was being deceived and that I had not been honest. And I tried several years running to come out to her, and I knew it had to happen. And it was actually the day after Christmas in 2005, the night before we had seen Brokeback Mountain, and there's this great scene where one of them is overheard, or they're overheard by the wife of one of the two men. And that just triggered. My son had discovered condoms in my drawer, and knowing that I had had a vasectomy, he was curious. I couldn't come out to him before coming out to my wife. So that gave me finally the impetus to go through with it and do it. And I remember the fear. You put your whole relationship, and if you've got a good relationship with your spouse, then you risk everything. And you also have this argument going through your head that you're bringing your family into this nightmare situation. It's sudden and it's scary. So those are the reasons maybe many of us resist finally coming out, even though we knew. In my situation, my wife was extremely supportive. And her very first comment to me, she wanted to know about my past and what it was like to carry this secret for all these years. And her first response was, how hard it must have been for me. Well, that was completely unexpected.
Because she really loves you.
Yes. It was not easy that first year, or I would say the first couple of years. but we had many, many heart-to-heart talks, a lot of crying sessions. We still talk about those days and this issue. I'll come to that a little bit more. So within a few weeks, I'd come out to my two kids. I told them and I told my wife that they didn't have to keep it a secret if there's someone that they needed to talk to about it. That was something that it was in my first conversation, my first coming out to my wife, it just popped into my head. And it really reflected that I was okay with being gay, but I was just not okay with what I had to do to stay in the closet. I think in many cases, the coming out leads to separation or divorce. A lot of times, a lot of anger. And I'm sure my wife was angry at times also. So I started going to a group called GAMA, Gay and Married Men's Association, which was now over 40-year-old group of men who are gay or bi and married to women and dealing with coming out or dealing with their sexuality while they're married to a straight woman. It's a peer support group, and I'll give you the link that you can add. But that group was a lot of help for me. My wife went to the Straight Spouse Network for meetings, and she got support from them, and sometimes was a little put off by how much anger she saw. But she held meetings in our house for several years and was very engaged. This is now 14 years later. We're still married. We moved into a retirement community just outside of Lancaster in a pretty conservative, religiously as well as politically conservative area. We knew when we moved in that there was no LGBT group on the campus. And it's a huge campus, like something like 1,800 people. So my wife was concerned whether it would be a safe place for me because I didn't want to jump into the closet. So we talked about that and finally decided if there wasn't a support group, we'd start one. Well, it turns out the day we moved in, there was the first meeting of a support group. So I went to that while the Packers were delivering our stuff. That's been a wonderful thing. It's been meeting monthly for a year, and most of the members are parents or grandparents of LGBT kids. And so it's a great place for gays as well as straights to talk about what it's like and what the climate is here in this community.
So that's kind of like a little itty bitty PFLAG in a way, your group. Because when I went to PFLAG here in Birmingham, where I live, it was interesting that, and PFLAG stands for Parents and Friends of Gay and Lesbians. That's for listeners who don't know. There were actually a lot of grandparents there, parents and grandparents. So it sounds kind of in a way that a similar makeup.
We tried to make it educational also, because a lot of the people in the community, even though they know of a relative or friend who's gay, they have a lot of questions, especially around transgender issues. So we have speakers, we've shown films, and we have lots of discussions. But it includes gay people and lesbians, of course, but there aren't many, at least many that we know about.
And it really makes you wonder, if some of them are. One of the things that concerns me, because I've learned from Sage about people going back into the closet.
Yeah. There was a support or a conference in Harrisburg, the capital of Pennsylvania, a few weeks ago that some of the administration of this community went. And as soon as I found out about it, I signed up. There was a Sage instructor as well as a chaplain from another retirement community who was a lesbian, who led the conference. And that was one of the surprises to me. Although it's reflecting about it, it's obvious. If you're worried about getting top-notch care and that you might run into someone who very subtly doesn't give you quite the same level of care as they normally would. So there's a fear. And the fact that someone would jump into the closet is just horrifying to me. just knowing how hard it is to come out and then to resist the urge to go back in.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to break in here to remind you of two things. First, I'm always looking for listeners who are willing to share their stories, either via email or by being a guest on the show. You never know how your story might help someone else. So if you're interested, please email me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. Second, if you find Graying Rainbows helpful, I hope you will consider supporting the show via Patreon. You can pick a monthly pledge that fits your budget. Your contribution will help offset the costs of producing the show, including audio editing. Thanks again for your support. So how old were your children when you came out?
So they were in their 20s. I know a lot of gamma guys whose kids are, well, all ages. And I always marvel how it would be for an adolescent to try to deal with that. But the kids of this generation are much different than what we were like as adolescents. And that's a good thing. The information is available. You can easily get information about this whole topic on the internet. That's one of the great things about living in today's world.
Yeah, they don't appreciate how hard won the situation is and how fragile it is, though.
Yes. So I also co-facilitate a group that was started by a woman in Lancaster City called Latent Life. It's aimed, like your podcast, is aimed at people who are dealing with latent life issues. As in with the people you've interviewed, all of the people who've come to our meeting were previously married to or are currently married to a straight spouse. That's the central latent life issue, I think.
Yes, I think it is. And of the women that I've met personally, one of the things that I noticed was in the people who aren't in a good marriage, sorting out the two issues, right? So like they would be like feeling all guilty, but then not be able to separate out that, well, this marriage is not good in the first place. It's surprising to me how many women are married to boys that have never grown up. And they're like, well, he needs me to take care of him. And I'm like,
why would you do that?
And I'm like, no. My husband was 9 years older than me, so I never had that situation. He was grown up when I got him. And so then they're all guilty when it seems like if they could just say, take the sexuality issue out, is this a good marriage? And then there's your situation, which is like my situation was. You know, I was married to the closest person in my life. And although my story played out differently because I did stay with my husband, but I never did anything. I think that's easier for women than it is for men. But I don't think he really ever got it. So for me, it wasn't until after he died that I was like, okay, that's it. Now, moving forward, I know I don't want to marry a man. Therefore, I must come out.
Yes. One of the things that bothered me about Kristen's interview with you was that she seemed to paint the picture that after the LGBT spouse comes out, that the world greets them with affirmation and they're welcomed into the LGBT community and they find the love of their lives and move on. I'm sure that does happen, but it really trivializes the difficulties and the pain from that broken relationship. The LGBT spouse, in my experience, and also hearing stories of a lot of gay men in this situation, they just aren't welcomed. Sometimes I feel like it's even harder if you choose to stay in your marriage and yet try to be happy as a gay man, in my case. I had a partner for 10 years after coming out, and we did our best. He was also a gamma guy, gay married guy. He would come over to our house and do family things, the holidays, birthdays, that sort of thing. And so we tried to normalize the situation. And my wife made that possible. when she first met him, she gave him a hug. And it was like, it's just the most supportive, wonderful thing. And this is why we're still married.
I'm glad that you shared that, because I don't know if you've heard my interview with Karen Strock. It's got horrible audio quality, unfortunately. I think the internet must be bad in New York City. But she wrote this book back in the 90s called Married Women Who Love Men. And I actually remember reading it back in the 90s. And it's in its second edition. I think she's working on the third. But she came on, and she's still with her husband and has kind of a 3-person something or other going on. I think it's just good to realize that there are different solutions, that not everybody fits in the, okay, I came out, now we have to break up, and that's the end. I think that's one reason why you really need to think, well, is there something about my marriage that's worth saving?
Yes, exactly.
And in your case, you had a lot that you wanted to save, and fortunately your wife agreed. And you're the hidden statistics, because nobody measures this stuff, right?
Right. And I think we're an invisible population, even though we may be certainly a significant fraction of all LGBT folks in the country.
Yeah, especially in certain age groups, right?
In certain age groups, yes, exactly. One of the things that rolls off people's lips sometimes when they're talking about this, that when they come out, they say they become more authentic, and they go on to say what that means to them, which is completely legitimate. But it's a little off-putting for those of us who are proud and gay, but in a relationship with a straight person. I feel very authentically gay. Let's accept a broader picture. Maybe we're part of that LGBTQ plus part of it.
Yeah, and the reason why my show's LGBT plus is because when I started, I was still uncomfortable with Q, because I came of age in the 70s when that was definitely a slur. And I'm thinking, I'm trying to attract older people who may also see that word as a slur.
Yes. Yeah, it was a terrible slur word for me. My name is Kearsley, which easily got morphed into Queersley when I was in the 7th grade. No one knew what that meant, but my dad was in the military, so we moved around. And it was like starting over. It was a matter of weeks. Every time I started a new school, I suddenly got tagged Queersley. Painful. Now I love it, of course. But queer is this term that is really all-inclusive. And even though it has pain attached to it for our generation, I think it's growing to be the all-inclusive term.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Although I would have liked to have kept gay. As a woman, I don't really like the word lesbian. I can't tell you why. And so I sort of resent the idea that gay now only applies to guys. Although that's only true within the community, because in the straight world, gay still means what it used to be. So it's kind of weird, right? It's like it depends on who you're talking to.
Right.
Yeah. So in this journey that you've been on, what would you say is the biggest surprise?
Well, certainly the relief that my wife, she exceeded my expectations. I thought it would take a long time to process. So that immediately was the first surprise. It was just unbelievably supportive beyond words. The other thing is, and Kristen makes this point in her interview with you, that years later, sometimes it takes years, but the couples that, regardless of how much anger there was in the initial year or two, that there's a final connection in which there's an understanding between the straight and the non-straight. And that's a wonderful thing. When you're dealing in the midst of the crisis happening, as she does with straight spouses, and as we did within this group Gamma, you focus more on the pain and the hardship and a lot of times the anger. And that gets resolved. And that's a wonderful thing, I think.
So you're talking to somebody who's just maybe finally decided that they're going to come out, but they're not sure what that's going to mean yet. what would you say is your advice based on your experience?
At the point where they're asking for advice, I would know a lot about their situation and can generally tell if there's an option for therapy that I should encourage, that there's unsure within themselves about what they need to do and what the harm will be and how to do it. This support group that I've mentioned a couple of times, Gamma, has a rule that we don't give advice. And our meetings are confidential and there's no judgment in our meetings. The no advice is because there's no clear solution. And the support that's given is mostly the sharing of stories. You can often respond to a question with, well, in my experience, this is what I did, rather than this is what you should do. And I think this is really critically important.
That's a good point. Usually when I ask people that question, the answer I get would not come across as the kind of advice that you're talking about in terms of trying to tell somebody specifically what to do. In fact, the most common theme that comes through when I ask this question is just, well, it was worth it. And that's not really advice.
Yeah. So almost all the time, it's a joyful thing. It's a healthy thing for everybody in the long run. It's just so bloody painful. And then there are times when it can be a very bitter, damaging thing. My siblings were angry at me for a while, a few months, mainly for the reason I felt guilty about, that I had not been honest. Not that I was gay, but why couldn't I share? It almost always turns out to be good. There are situations where it could be physically harmful. There could be horrible outcomes. So go slow, at least from the point of view of the LGBT spouse. I think Kristen's spot on with you have to give them time to adjust. When we choose to come out, we've thought it through, we've agonized over it, we've thought about the words we'd use maybe, and it's just a matter of having the courage to deliver. For the straight spouse, it is, my God, my world has been turned upside down in 2 minutes. It takes time to process. And there is support. There's support all over the country, actually. For men, there's an online group called Husbands Out to Wives. And it's got well over 1,000 members. I think 2,000 over the years have signed up, but they move in and move out, of course, as they work out their situations.
Yeah, I would appreciate you sharing those links with me because obviously since I'm female, my personal knowledge of resources tends to be in the other direction. And that's one reason why I really appreciate you coming on the show. I really feel, as you said earlier, this issue of marriage is something that it doesn't matter if you're a gay man, a lesbian, transgender, anybody that's older, that's going to be a big issue. And it sets us apart from the younger people they're dealing with, well, what's my identity? You know what your identity is. This is not about your identity. So, our struggle is a different struggle. And so we need to help each other.
Yes.
So thank you for being part of that.
So I thought of another surprise, and that was how hard it was to stay out of the closet once you're out. That particularly when you're in a family situation, you have all these friends, and you often get the response from a straight person, why didn't you just keep this to yourself? That was a real surprise. Also, even today, we've been living in this retirement community for about a year. I find it difficult to come out with it. You're sort of torn with, you don't want to burden the other person, and the topic of one's sexuality doesn't often come up around the dinner table that you're sharing with people you're meeting for the first time. And yet, then it's, okay, so maybe next time, or the people you get to know better. How do you bridge that gap? It is surprising.
That's a really good point. I consider myself to be totally out, but I don't think I've ever talked to anybody in my neighborhood about it. It's not really a retirement community, but it's a isolated street that's mostly older people. And I realize actually that I'm a little bit scared. I don't at this point see what I have to gain. You know, I came into the neighborhood as a widow, and that's a safe identity. And so I kind of think, well, until I haven't even had a date yet. So I've been trying to get a date for 4 years. But anyway, that's a different issue. So I'm sort of like, well, until I actually have a person in my life, it's not worth it. And that's the reason why that whole thing coming out is not a one-time deal. I don't think in our lifetimes it's ever going to be a one and done thing.
Yes. And that's something not appreciated by the straights, I don't think.
Well, it's also not appreciated by younger people why it is hard for your generation, my generation, and those older than us. I mean, it's funny. I actually had to put an age limit on the Facebook group, and I made it low. I made it 30. Because there was problems coming from perceived problems by older members of the group. I don't think anything actually ever happened, but they were worried because younger people's idea of later in life, I think it's about 10 years older than however old they are.
Yes.
And so I didn't want to cut anybody out, but really now they're like, oh, you didn't come out when you were a teenager? 20s is later in life. Well, yeah. I really think there's a big dividing line between those of us who came of age before HIV and after.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So we wrestled in this later in life group that I'm working with. We wrestled with that definition also about whether we should put any age at all. And I felt really strongly that later in life issues are what we're talking about. So if you've been married, if you have kids, and that can happen in mid-20s, right? It happens all the time. That's a late in life issue that you've got to struggle with. I was amazed to find out that there were people in their 20s who would come to our support group meetings for gay married men. It's still an issue because there are parts of the country where you are channeled into one path in life, and that's where you're expected to stay in that channel. And when you realize that's not you, you have a major problem and you need support. Whether it's peer support or professional support, you need it. And so late in life to me means late in life issues.
Good point. And that's why I didn't even want to put an age limit. It was just that I knew that there was going to be trouble in the group if I didn't address their concerns. I'm certainly hoping and knowing that there are people who listen to this podcast who are all ages. But I do think, like you make the point of the issues of dealing with your marriage, talking to your kids. Those are the big ones. Because the family ones don't ever go away. Although, like, my parents were dead when I came out, and I don't think they would have cared, but the parents are a big, big piece of a younger person's journey. Was there anything else, Eric, that you'd like to share before we close?
I'm delighted. I love your podcast. I love the episode where you interviewed the SAGE people and the AARP people. I was completely unaware that AARP has this LGBT research effort. I couldn't find them on their website. You have to know where to go. So I'm a little worried they're not quite as out as I'd like to see them, but I was thrilled that they're investing. They understand the issues. And SAGE is like, it's a breath of fresh air that and this is long-term group working on this.
I haven't had much success in reaching the main SAGE office. The people that I got on the show I met at Creating Change last year. I think a couple of the original founders of SAGE are still alive, and I think it would be really nice to get one of them on. So I appreciate that feedback.
I'm really interested in LGBT history. I've written several articles now on our website about the history of Gamma. And it really is amazing that our group started in 1970. Our first meeting was January 78. And I think our group actually led to there was a group called Gamma Wives that changed their names to Straight Spouses, for God's sake. So it may be one of those groups that Amity Buxton of the Straight Spouse, who founded the Straight Spouse Network, might have had contact with.
Yeah. I'd also like to get somebody from PFLAG because they're a really important resource, especially in small communities that might not have other groups. So I appreciate that feedback. I don't get very much feedback about interest in history, and I've been struggling with how much to continue to put it in the show. So I appreciate that feedback.
Well, I've really enjoyed talking to you, and you're doing great work. I've joined the Facebook page. I'd recommend it to everyone.
Well, please do share the show. Like I said, it's hard to grow a podcast like this because, people aren't doing too much word of mouth. But thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
On my other podcast, I used my closing remarks as an opportunity to review the key ideas, but when someone shares their personal story, I like to let it stand on its own. I just want to mention that Eric's story reminds me that there is no one-size-fits-all journey. Each of us must find our own way, and I'm grateful that he took his time to share his with us. I'll include the links to GMMA and the other resources that he mentioned in the show notes. You ought to be able to see these in your podcasting app, but you can also find them by going to our website at grayingrainbows.com. Of course, I'd love to hear from you. Send me email at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. You can submit voice feedback at speakpipe.com/grayingrainbows. And you can also post on the Graying Rainbows Facebook fan page. I do want to take a minute to explain the difference between the Facebook fan page and the private group on Facebook. As most of you realize, Facebook fan pages are totally public. So that's where you post when you want to tell the whole world how much you love Graying Rainbows. The Facebook group is private, which means only members of the group can see what's posted there. That's why you have to ask to join, and you have to briefly explain why you want to join. The group is currently restricted to people over the age of 30. I realize the meaning of later in life is a moving target. The difference between a private group and a secret group is that membership in a private group is publicly available. If you are at the stage where you need a secret group, please email me so I can help you find the one that fits your needs. One last thing about the private group. I want to give a shout out to Midge Noble because she manages the group on a daily basis. She's also available for private coaching for anyone that's interested. If you aren't on Facebook, you can find her contact information in the show notes for episode 21. Last but not least, I want to thank those of you who are supporting Graying Rainbows via Patreon. I'll be back on the first Monday in February with another episode, but until then, I hope you will check out my other podcasts, Brain Science and Books and Ideas. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to talking with you again very soon. Graying Rainbows is copyright Virginia Campbell, MD. You can copy this show to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com.